Okay, let's get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Phillimore. I'm the Deputy Director of ACSES, and I've been involved with ACSES for at least 10 years since it started, so it's great to be here. So let's get moving. This afternoon we've got our keynote speech by Dr. Omar Khan. Now, some of you may not know who Omar is. He's the Chief Executive of the Centre for Transforming Access and Student Outcomes in Higher Education in Britain. TASO, as it's often called, T-A-S-O. And I'm sure he'll talk a little bit, or a lot, in fact, about what TASO does. Omar, originally from the US, went to Britain, went back to the US for a little bit, but he's basically been in Britain for the last 25 or maybe even longer years, and has an incredibly impressive CV, which you'll be able to see from looking at your program there. So Omar is going to be talking about addressing inequality in higher education. So he's in the right place and we're in the right place. So because we're a little bit late, I won't do any more other than ask you to welcome Omar to the stage. Omar, over to you.
Thank you for the warm introduction. And yeah, you'll notice immediately that I haven't lost my American accent despite having been in England for 25 years. And I do want to say one caveat now, actually thinking about my presentation, is although it's titled Inequality in the UK, it's more relevant to England specifically, and I'm happy to take questions about that afterwards, but we have a curious situation in the UK where we have differential regulation in the three nations of England, Scotland, and Wales. And so most of what I'm saying today applies only to the UK. Let's see, how's my clicker? Should I be pointing it? Okay, got it. Introduction to TASO. Yeah, I'm going to call it TASO because it's a mouthful, the Center for Transforming Access and Student Outcomes in Higher Education. But I do want to say one thing, because it's come up quite a lot of times, that the student outcomes, I think, is a really important part of what we're doing. We're trying to remind ourselves that the reason we care about things isn't just because we care about equity abstractly or because we care about good evaluation of methodology. There are human beings here at the end of this, and the reason we're here is to improve lives. We are an independent hub for higher education providers, principally in England, although our resources are used in Scotland and Wales, to access research, toolkits, you can see it on the screen, evaluation techniques, and more to help widen participation and improve equality. We were founded in 2019. I had the fun job of starting my job in the 1st of June 2020 in the midst of a lockdown, trying to spin this out as a new organization, which was a bit of a challenge, and it did affect some of our initial research findings, so I'll talk about that a bit later as well. We are an affiliate What Works Centre. Some of you may be familiar that in the UK, since around 2012, the UK government has had this focus on What Works centres. I think the one that has made the most impact is one that I think some of you may be interested in, the Education Endowment Foundation. So that focuses specifically on inequalities in schools. And obviously we work with them. We sort of think of them as a sister What Works Centre. We have meetings amongst the What Works Centres to try to learn from each other. And I did want to say two things about that, which is that all the What Works Centres, and there are around 10 of us, we focus on things like homelessness, earlier intervention. We're the higher education one. We have two features that I think are distinctive, is we do tend to focus on more quantitative and causal research, although I will indicate that we don't just do that. And we also tend to focus not merely on the question of what works generally in a policy area, but what works to tackle inequalities, right? So we're not just asking, there's that sort of specific angle, including of the Education Endowment Foundation. So there's our vision and mission. So our vision is to eliminate equality gaps in higher education, and our mission is to improve lives through evidence-informed practice. So we are an independent charity is one thing I wanted to emphasize, and I'm going to be coming on to the regulatory environment. And I think hearing the conversation over the day, one thing that I've really been struck by is you're about to embark on this new commission, and I think there are some features of the English landscape that might be interesting to you, some strengths, maybe some challenges, some food for thought. I am not an expert on your context, but I do think some of the things that I'll be talking about today might be relevant for you in thinking through the next phase of implementing the Accord. I also wanted to say that we are not a campaigning group. We are sort of an evidence-based organization, but I will be saying some things about the importance of ensuring that we have activism and campaigning and thinking through the theory of change as to how you tackle inequality in our societies. Where am I pointing this? There we go. Ah. Not sure it's working. Okay, thanks. So, briefly how we work. This is a sort of summary slide. So we first have an evidence cycle where we identify gaps, and I just thought I'd quickly indicate the sort of 5 areas where we've produced those evidence reports. First is on pre-entry, so the access piece. We've looked at what are the different inequalities across the UK in terms of accessing higher education. The second was the post-entry space, so the completion rates, the proportion who are getting good degrees, which we classify as getting a first or 2-1, how those vary by different groups. We don't actually tend to use the word equity groups, which I will come on to the language. And actually, another caveat, our language is different, not wholly different, but I think you'll notice this throughout my presentation. But I think the same challenges that are addressed to the language used in the Australian context, it is and can be leveled in the UK context in terms of the language we use. So we did one review looking at the pre-entry evidence of what works, one review on the post-entry evidence. Then we did a review looking at employment, labor market outcomes, so what kind of activities universities are doing to improve employment activities. So that's the whole student life cycle. And then we did 2 cross-cutting reviews, one on disability and one on mental health. So those 5 studies were published. And then we follow that up in the next phase by commissioning new evaluations and research, working with partners with that focus on causal evidence. So I'll just give you sort of 2 examples. So in the pre-entry evidence review, we found kind of indicative evidence that summer schools were good for improving participation, right? So summer schools, I don't know how common they are here, but in the UK, residential summer schools at age 16 or earlier to try to encourage young people to attend university are very popular intervention. They're seen to be effective in people then attending university, so they're seen as an effective implementation. So we ran a randomized control trial with 8 providers to look at the extent to which that was true. And the reason we did that is there's always been a slight suspicion with summer schools that the kinds of kids who go on to a summer school were already likely to attend higher education anyway. So the fact that we know the evidence shows that a summer school leads to increased participation rates, is that explained by the fact that the summer school is really excellent? Or is that explained rather by some sort of unobserved characteristics about the students in question who are already likely to attend university anyway? So rather than allowing universities to select young people, we forced them to randomly allocate a summer school place or not a place. And that allowed us to pick out to what extent the summer school was driving the change or whether or not unobserved student characteristics. Now, one problem with this work was that it was supposed to be done in the summer of 2020. Something happened in the world that meant that there were no face-to-face summer schools or any other kind of face-to-face activities, at least in the UK, and I think you had a pretty tough lockdown here as well. And then in 2021, the summer schools did proceed, but they were online only. So we've had to run it in 2021 on some online summer schools and in 2022 with the face-to-face summer schools. We don't yet have those findings, and that was another challenge in terms of thinking about the time scale that we need to look at these outcomes. Obviously, these were 16-year-olds doing a summer school in 2022. We're not going to know whether they enroll in university and what their outcomes are for some years down the track. But the indicative evidence is, in fact, that most of those kids do look like they were going to attend university anyway. When we asked them in the pre-survey, were you likely to attend university? The proportion, I don't know if anyone wants to guess, but it was 93% said yes. So, for us to demonstrate an effect size there, it's going to have to be at like 98, 99%, which basically means summer schools may be a good intervention for converting very likely people into being completely likely, or they may be a very good recruitment tool for a particular institution to ensure that they get that student to enroll. But that's not really the reason why we think that summer schools should be delivered. A second example was we did some work looking at, and I'm going to be coming on to this, the ethnicity degree awarding gap. So the gap between the proportion of white students and black and minority ethnic students, so that's the terminology we use, who get a good degree, a first or a 2-1. And we used a quasi-experimental design using a difference in difference approach to look at whether or not, the literature review in the first phase found that there's this very large gap that I'm going to come on to. So we then commissioned some evaluations to try to tease out what are universities doing to address this gap, and are they effective? So we worked with 2 universities to look at whether their curriculum reform, one was a diversifying and one was a decolonizing the curriculum, had any impact on degree outcomes. And unfortunately, we didn't actually find that those were effective, although I have some caveats to that finding. So we then learn and reflect from that evidence, and we identify new gaps. And in fact, from that curriculum reform work, one of the findings was that universities weren't very well implementing these curriculum reforms. So we went back to basics and said, well, what's your theory of change? And so that kind of comes down to my last point. Although we're, fancy organization doing nice swish methods, we recognize not everyone in the sector can do this. And we also are 15 people, and there's over 150 universities. So obviously, we're not going to be able to partner with everyone. So a key part of what we're here to deliver is resources for the sector in the UK, for universities themselves, for practitioners, for evaluators, to do that work in their own context, in their own institution. And so we've created a lot of guidance resources for them. And if I was speaking in the UK, I'd say you to do this work in your context, not for me to do it for you, but to try to upskill, support, and learn from you what kinds of resources you need to improve evaluation. And the reason that matters is because, it's great to have a commitment to equity, but at the end of the day, we need to make sure that what we're doing is actually moving the dial for the students that we purport to care about. And those are some of the other resources that we have, and I'm going to come on to what the ask and the mode is. But one of the things we've also done is helped practitioners navigate university ethics committees, because a lot of the people working in the access and participation space, I don't know about here, but in England and in the UK, are not researchers. They tend to be people who were maybe previously teachers or youth workers who are really good at, working with 16-year-olds and 70-year-olds to encourage them to go to university. Once they have to start doing kind of evaluations, they have to submit those to ethics if they become a certain kind of research standard, and that's obviously not something they're used to doing. So we've produced some guidance on that. Next slide. So what is the UK context on inequalities first? So as I said, this is our language, so it won't be exactly the same as yours, and I'm going to have to explain some of the terms. But I think the overall picture I'm painting is the same as what you're going to find with what you call your various equity groups. And I think the other thing I hopefully this will show is the value of good data collection, and that's a very big theme of my presentation. So the top line and the blue line. So there's 3 lines here. The top line is the proportion. So this is looking at free school meal children versus non-free school meal children. So in the UK, the poorest children in the country get free school meals, and they are data is well collected on their outcomes in our context, and there's a big gap between the proportion of children who receive free school meals and those who do not receive free school meals in terms of the proportion that attend higher education. And this shows that trend over time. Now, you could tell a positive story about this trend line looking at the blue bottom line that starts on the far left at the bottom and then sort of moves up slowly. So that shows that, I think I can just about read this, in 2000, what's the first? Yeah, 2005-06, under 15% of free school meal children were attending higher education, and it was more like over 30%, so twice as high for people who didn't attend free school meal, right? So kids who were in receipt of free school meals, less than 15%, went on to higher education, whereas over 30% of children who were not in receipt of free school meals went on to higher education. So the good news story is that the proportion of children on free school meals who now attend university is now approaching 30%. So it's gone from 15 to 30. And one interesting thing, and I'm going to be coming on to this, is in 2012 we introduced these very high tuition fees, which I'm sure you might be aware of. And there was some concern that that might have an impact on the proportion of free school meal kids going to university, but it didn't. So this was taken as evidence by some policymakers that there was no deterrent effect of increasing the fees to that amount. But the less positive news story is if you look at the top line, at the same time that the free school meal participation rate went up, the non-free school meal participation rate went up by the same amount. And so that bottom line that you see that doesn't really move, that's kind of flat, is the gap, right? So we've seen an increase in the number of kids from poor backgrounds going to university. But we've also seen a mass expansion of university over the same period of time. So you could argue that we've done a good job of increasing participation, but we've done almost nothing to close the equality gap, right? Because the gap is the exact same as it was then, 15 percentage points roughly. So we've got work to do. That's why what works matters. This is an even harder chart to read, but basically this shows that free school meal status, there was a discussion about intersectionality by ethnicity and by gender, and it shows on the left-hand side the different ethnic groups and gender, male and female on left and right respectively, and it shows which ethnic groups are more or less likely to attend university. It might be surprising for some of you to see that white British is third from the bottom, and that most of the ethnic minority groups have higher, indeed much higher participation rates. And also the gap between free school meals and non-free school meals is very different by ethnic group. So you could argue that the influence of class is different in different groups. But obviously these kinds of data do show you that there are different inequalities for different groups. And if you're interested in trying to tackle access issues, you do need to understand, what kinds of interventions you want to adopt. I won't belabor that point, but you'll have it. So this was, I'd refer to the ethnicity degree awarding gap, and there's been some discussion about part-time students, which we do have here as well. So this gap represents the difference between the proportion of white students and the students on screen in the numbers who get a first or a 2-1. So a first or a 2-1 is both an indicator that you've done well on your course, but is also used by a lot of employers to sift out graduate employment. So it matters both in terms of the student experience. Has the university offered an equal opportunity on course for their students, regardless of their ethnic or racial background, but also to the extent that this outcome at university has a huge impact on later life, on employment, it's a gap that we should care about. And as you can see there, the gap is very large for black students, but it's also there for all groups, and it's larger for part-time than for full-time. And another reason it's good to have data, again, this is a kind of messy chart, but this basically shows that for any level of qualification, so below you have the various different kinds of entry qualifications to higher education, A star, A star, A, those like the highest qualification you can get. Then B.Tech are kind of more vocational type qualifications that universities also do accept. And the top line in the whole, across the chart is white groups. So what you can see is for any given qualification level, white groups, whether or not they get 3 A's, 3 C's, or vocational qualifications, are more likely to get a good degree. And the reason this matters is one of the hypotheses as to why you have a degree awarding gap is because black students or Asian students do worse at school. But this proves that at least can't be the that can't be the driver of the gap. So prior attainment can explain the variance, as the title says. Next slide. So in conclusion, or in summary around the UK, and I think this resonates with what you've been saying about your context here, is that inequalities are persistent and widespread, but they're also quite varied. So we need to understand the inequalities that affect getting into university, the access piece, but also getting on and how they do when they're there. We also have to understand that those gaps differ quite a lot by individuals or groups, whether it's ethnicity, class, first and family, gender, or disability. And the other thing I wanted to flag, we've been doing some work on student mental health, is it does change over time. So there's a survey, we have some very good student surveys in the UK, and one of them asks, do you feel you're having a mental health difficulty? And the proportion who are now saying that has almost tripled over 9 years. So it's now roughly 1 in 6. And so if you say there's 2 million undergraduates, that's 350,000 students. It's not a small number of people. So, the inequalities are persistent, widespread, and varied, but they also do change over time. What was an issue yesterday may be less of an issue today or more of an issue tomorrow. So, yeah, I think I've made that point. I also think, I thought I'd sort of put this little few slides in why it's possible for TASO to have an impact or drivers of social change. And I heard the conversation around translation and impact, and I think it's a really key question. Because we are a what works center, and there is a kind of premise there, right? That if we have the right evidence, change is going to happen. We need to know who the equity groups are. If we all just design good solutions, that's enough. We got the evidence, think change will happen. Well, I don't think that's actually how change happens, and especially as someone who advocates for theories of change. I think it's important to think through what is our theory of change as to how evidence would have an impact on practice and change the world for your universities, but also then ultimately for the students. And I do think there are some things, at least from the UK context, that I did hear some of this resonated today, right? So the first is political consensus, and I think it is really important that the Minister, Jason Clare, is thinking about how does he embed this in the long term. The political consensus on this was started actually by the Conservative Party. They were the people who kind of introduced some of these access and participation plans that I'm going to come on to. The minister, Joe Johnson at the time, and then the previous minister and the next minister, they all agreed with this, and the Labour Party were also backing it. I think there's another interesting question around a what works approach does kind of assume that this isn't a sort of too electorally hot potato of a kind of an issue, because we can have the question about what's the evidence, not the question of does this matter and why does it matter, and these kinds of, once it becomes an electorally salient issue, it's a little harder to sort of just deflect democratic considerations, right? And I think, I won't belabor that point, but I think if an issue is particularly sensitive, like, for example, immigration, it becomes less easy to talk about what works. And in fact, arguably less democratic. There's also some policy and regulatory drivers. That's my next slide. And I also did want to talk about wider societal drivers, right? So you were using the term social license, which I'm not actually familiar. We don't use that kind of language, but obviously you're getting into the fact that, we talk about what we want to achieve here, but what we want to achieve here definitely requires some consent, and there are definitely people in our society who have views about this, not just the students, not just their parents, and not just journalists and politicians. So I thought I'd just talk about some of those drivers in the UK context, and I think student voice is actually a really key one here, and I've used the example of Black Lives Matter. So that ethnicity degree awarding gap problem, inequality, has been around for 20 years. But after 2020, with the murder of George Floyd and the rise of Black Lives Matter, all of a sudden it became more of an issue for universities, right? And it's really striking to me that one of the ways in which the salience of that issue moved up the agenda was through students making demands on universities to tackle this gap. So I do think that that is a driver, and that if you're not sensitive to it, I'm not saying you're not, but it's also something that you can mobilize, right? It's something that can be used to effectively bring change forward. And I do see that tomorrow you have a kind of student voice panel, which I think is really crucial. I do also think that in this context, public opinion is supportive. I think most people do think it's unfair that a lot of people are unable to access higher education. But we've also seen some level of polarization around culture wars, especially around the issue of race, actually. But there's polarization also on issues like contextualized admissions, which is the notion that you might offer lower tariff entry points. So to get into the higher, we talk about tariff points, so it means how well you did at school in your A levels, determines what kind of course or university you can go to. And universities are talking about making contextualized offers, which means if you have a disadvantaged background and you needed, say, 3 A's at A level, you might be able to get in on 2 A's and a B. There's been a lot of pushback on that by middle-class parents and journalists saying, you're letting in less qualified poor kids. Why don't we get places at Oxbridge and the Russell Group? And so there is some level of polarization, both in terms of culture war, but also in terms of things like that. So you do have to think through these things minimally. And as I say, some parents and students have greater voice. That is both more privileged parents, but as I said, I think there are voices now coming through the system in a way that you wouldn't necessarily have seen that kind of pressure before. And the final point, I won't belabor it too much. I'm assuming it's resonant for a lot of you. We were talking about equity and social mobility and social justice, but at least in the UK, there's real issues around public finance. There's real issues around solvency for some institutions. And when they're looking at some of these issues, it's clear that student numbers have an impact on their overall budget. So they are driven, that is a driver as much as social justice considerations. So those are some other drivers. And then I'm coming on to this because I do think this is kind of, I'll let you make your inferences from this about what it might mean for your context. But I think the UK policy and regulatory context is distinctive, both in terms of the fees regime. Oops, could you go back a slide? I've gone forward too many, yeah. So the legislative and policy context. As I said, there's been a fees regime. I think the fees were first introduced in 1997. When they were 1,000, they were then raised to 3,000 under New Labour. And then in 2012, they were raised quite sharply to 9,250. There was a lot of discussion about that. I have said there was relative political consensus on that. It's probably not quite true to say that. The Liberal Democrats went into the coalition saying that they would scrap tuition fees, and then when they came into coalition with the Conservatives, they agreed to that. Under Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party said they would scrap those fees, although they are no longer saying that. But generally speaking, it's hard to see that that policy is going to change. I did want to flag one thing, though, that it does imply, and it feeds on from the next bullet point, which is, although they are fees, they're more seen as a loan, and there's a repayment period over time. Initially, this was 30 years. This has now been extended to 40 years. There is interest applied to it, and it seems like from the conversations I've picked up here, your interest rates are much lower. I'll put it that way. And I think there are some real serious questions around things like completion rates. You can be much less agnostic about whether a student completes a course even if they leave on 1st of November of their first year, they're taking on £9,250 of debt, which they will have to repay over 40 years. So I don't think that's a bit of the context that changes whether or not you think, for example, completion rates would be a relevant target. I think in that context, if students are taking on that kind of debt, universities owe them more to ensure that they try to complete. That would be my argument. And then this driver, this lever, that I'd be curious to see what the audience thinks as a possible lever or a possible kind of thing that, the next phase of the Accord might consider, which is access and participation plans. So when the fees went up, there was an awareness that this might just translate into universities trying to put more bums on seats, right? Trying to just get lots of money in and not care about the equity issues. So they were required under the regulation to provide what were called access and participation plans, and I'll come on to those in a moment. So every university has to write to the regulator to indicate what it's doing on access and participation, and I'll explain that further. Initially, this was through something called OFFA, the Office for Fair Access. That OFFA was rolled into a new regulator, so I think, and I know there are mixed views about the Office for Students, not merely here in Australia, but the Office for Students only applies to England, so there are mixed views about it in Wales and Scotland, for example. They chose not to go into it, obviously, so that is a pretty strong indicator that there are mixed views of that regulatory model. But I think there are some interesting strengths of it that I'm going to come on to. So, yeah. So the OFS took on the Office for Fair Access's regulatory requirement to have access and participation plans. Initially, access and participation plans had quite hard targets. So they had hard targets on things like the proportion of students that each provider would have from, we call it polar quintiles. So it's basically quintiles of the geography of the country that have less participation. So all providers would have a sort of universal target that they all had to hit. There was also a target to close that ethnicity degree awarding gap. There was a view that that was actually not leading to behavior change, and it was not leading to the outcomes desired, that a target-based approach was ineffective. So late in 2022, they consulted on a new approach. Rather than having targets that were universal for all providers, they adopted what they are calling, and you may like this, you may or may not like this as an acronym, EOR, E-O-R-R, which is the Equality of Opportunity Risk Register. And the idea being that each provider in its access and participation plans would look at the data for their student population and write up what they were going to focus on, right? Now, on the one hand, you could view that as a concern. Perhaps universities will just cherry pick the easiest inequalities that they're able to tackle. But on the other hand, it then puts the ball in the university's court to say, you've got to look at your data, you've got to figure out which inequalities really matter, and you have to publish that publicly. So, not just the Office for Students as a regulator is going to hold you to account for what you've printed as the key inequalities in your risk register that you think you need to attend to, but students can say, hang on a minute, you've identified this risk, this inequality. We actually think the inequalities that matter at our institution are these ones, and you haven't even mentioned them in your plan. So the publicity element is, I think, quite interesting too. So a different regulatory approach from hard targets that were universally applied to all providers, which had the benefit of, at a macro level, potentially moving the dial faster, but were deemed not to be very effective because we did a sort of more narrative review of about 180 access and participation plans, and we found the same language in all of them. It was almost regurgitating what the regulator was asking them to do. And then when you looked at the outcomes, there was no difference. So it did sort of look like box ticking. It did sort of look like the regulator was driving a compliance culture as opposed to an outcomes culture, but also as opposed to the university engaging directly with the data, right? What do we need to do to move the dial? What are the inequalities that really matter at our institution? I think there is a danger, as I said, that some inequalities that you might think really matter are not the ones that are prioritized. So, why evaluate that? And obviously one reason, as I've just said, and I'm going to go on to elaborate a bit, is because the OFS says so. So I do think that the regulatory stick, to put it sort of too crassly, is driving some behavior change, has made the issue not merely of equity, but of evaluating these activities to see whether they're really effective, because the OFS is requiring it. And so I'll just quickly skim through. This is what they've produced, two regulatory notices around strengthening evaluation. Next slide, hopefully. So this is regulatory notice 1, and what I wanted to indicate is, in addition to making sure that you identify the risks to inequality, you have to show what you're doing in terms of evaluating those activities. So you have to consider whether or not the planned activities that you're undertaking, for example, a summer school, for example, some mentoring activities, for example, partnering with a local school, are they actually achieving their intended outcomes? So that's, and then furthermore, it's not merely that you have to do it case by case. You have to demonstrate in your plan, what is your approach to supporting evaluative capacity in your institution? How are you investing at your university and ensuring that evaluation is core business, that everything that you're doing to improve student outcomes is underpinned by not just an aspiration that this will benefit some kids, but this will actually move the dial on inequality, and that we're evaluating them to determine whether they're effective. So the next one, and not just that, and this comes to the publicity point, you have to publish those evaluations, right? You can't just sit on them, have them buried somewhere in your internal website. You have to publish that. And then finally, there are a number of resources, and this is in some ways indicating our resources at TASO, but also evidence that's out there in secondary data around, and also on your own internal data on your student population, that there's sources of evidence that you need to use to inform those intervention strategies. So you have to show that the way in which you've designed your interventions and your evaluations of them is underpinned by evidence. So that's it. Next slide. So this is it in a nutshell. That evaluation is important because it helps the provider to understand whether the intervention strategies and activities are effectively addressing the risk to equality of opportunity identified through the assessment of performance, and robust evaluation is crucial. So this is the other point. I actually wanted to pick this up. There's been a lot of talk about collaboration. I think there's some view, and I somewhat share it, is that there is a lot of reinventing the wheel going on in evaluation. You'll see one provider do a summer school, another provider do a summer school. If we publish and do robust evaluation and we learn from each other, that's obviously going to move our practice forward more quickly. So next slide. But I think it is a little bit too crass, and I'm really pleased to be in this audience where everyone is committed to inequality and evaluation, to say that it's just because the regulator says so. And I do think there's a danger here if you just respond to regulative or policy levers, that you may forget the students, as some people have said, but also you may forget like some of the reasons why you should evaluate in the first place. And I think I'm going to sort of rehearse those arguments. Next slide. We want to know what works, because in the end of the day, it's not good enough for me just to care deeply about an issue. It's not enough even for me to say I care that issue is effective. I need to make sure that I'm measuring that, assessing that, talking to students, figuring out what those outcomes are, and evaluating it. And that's the only way we're going to know whether the values that we purport to hold have the impact in the world that we want to see. It's not just a kind of methodological thing. But we recognize there's some challenges. There's a lot of different activities that are happening. So how do you go about deciding which one you're going to evaluate? And we recognize, there's There's where in the student life cycle are you interested in access, continuation, or progression? What kinds of activities? Is it tutoring, information, advice, and guidance, or mentoring? And if you're new to the field, in particular, if you're a practitioner, it can be difficult to know where do you even start. Next slide and we also recognize, not least because we experience it ourselves, that in an ideal world, we'd evaluate everything at the most robust possible level everywhere, but funnily enough, we don't live in an ideal world. And I've already heard today that there's a big question mark even around the implementation of the Accord in terms of how much resources is actually going to be allocated here. So there is a tension here between obviously the maximum impact and limited resources. So I do think when thinking about what to evaluate, you should both think about which inequalities are most pressing, but also what interventions are you really rolling out at scale. If you're investing a lot of money in certain kinds of activities to improve student outcomes, for example, you really should be evaluating those ones first, the ones that affect the most students. And in response, sometimes I hear, and I think one of the things that I've learned is sometimes when I first was giving these speeches, people were thinking that what I was saying is, you guys, you practitioners, you really care, but you're doing a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't work and it's all kind of useless. That's definitely not what I'm saying. I'm saying I suspect most of it does work, but it works better for some students and in different contexts, and we do need to evaluate it. And one response I get quite a lot is, well, we don't need to evaluate that. We already know that this works. And so my question is always, well, are you sure? And I've already given the example of summer schools where, we thought it was a summer school, but actually it looks more like it's the characteristics of the students who are driving the positive outcomes. Another kind of counterintuitive-ish example is mentoring, although I would want to caveat this by saying the evidence is a bit mixed on mentoring. One of the things about assessing mentoring is that if the students who go on summer schools tend to be students who are already more likely to go to higher education, mentoring programs, at least as delivered in the UK, tend to be targeted on students who are further away, right? So say that the people who get mentoring are actually students who the university or feels that would benefit from it. And often they're students who are actually less likely to apply to universities. So if you ran an evaluation and you found, okay, I have 5 minutes left. That's not good. If you found an evaluation and you found that the mentoring program was ineffective, it might be because you're actually trying to move the dial on a population that's very difficult. So you need to make sure that your comparator group was actually the relevant comparator group, right? And I'll just run through these really quickly just to say, these are studies of that people felt were definitely going to work and were motivated by good intentions. So this was a study that they were trying to reduce teenage pregnancy rates. And so they gave dolls to girls in the idea that they would learn how difficult it was to look after them, and it actually had the reverse effect. So, and this was another example. So this was a criminal justice program where they introduced young people who are at risk of offending to people who had served prison sentences and said, I'm going to tell you how terrible my experience was. Again, no effect. Did not decrease the proportion of people. So people who went on that program were no less likely to go to be incarcerated than others. And then the final one is, this is a UK-based example. For children who've been in care, there was this thought that if you embed social workers in schools, that might be a better environment. And that actually, we found that those had worse outcomes. So again, a positive thought, right? That social workers being embedded in schools, working with teachers to work particularly with those schools, would improve outcomes for those kids. It actually had the reverse effect. So we pulled that policy, and there are no longer social workers in schools based on that evidence. Next slide. So how to evaluate? I will run through these quite quickly. What I do want to show you, and there are quite a lot of slides here, basically the point I want to get across is we're here to help the sector at TASO, and I think it is useful to think through some of the conditions that make us effective. And I think part of it is that we do understand the sector. We're an independent charity. We aren't the regulator, so people trust our resources, but we've also developed our resources with the sector. So we run focus groups, we design our resources, then we road test them, we sort of tweak them as we go along. So maybe next slide. The OFS has these standards of evidence, type 1, type 2, type 3. We are mainly set up to improve the level of causal evidence in terms of the research that we commission. but we are also trying to improve type 1 evidence. So next slide, actually keep going. I don't know why my clicker. So this is the kind of thing that we've got. We've got this monitoring evaluation framework that helps people plan, diagnose. We've got all these webinars, and we have an evidence toolkit. I did want to say one thing about the toolkit that potentially is different from here. So the evidence does come from the UK context, and one thing that we found in the UK context is we actually don't really have an issue around aspirations. When you ask people in the Millennium Cohort Study, so that's parents, we did a cohort of all children born in 2000, and 90% of parents, when those children were 6, said that they wanted their kids to go to higher education, and there was no real difference by social class. So it doesn't appear that our issue is aspiration. So that might be an example where, in general, I think our toolkit would be useful for you in your context, but our toolkit may not be so relevant in some cases. So one of the principal things that we've done to support access and participation plans at the OFS is helping providers design theories of change. And this is what they look like. You've got outputs, activities, and I wanted to say a few things about this, and I know I'm running short on time. First is that it's really useful to do this with practitioners, evaluators, and researchers together. One of the things we find is that practitioners often have an intervention and they have a particular aim or outcome in mind that they think they're achieving. And the evaluator or the researcher may have a different view. And one of the reasons these things are important is to be very clear, what is it that your intervention is trying to achieve? So for example, on the summer schools, as I said, a lot of people, once we talked to them, some of them actually didn't think it was about improving increasing participation. It was actually around belonging once those people got in. Well, that's fine, but then if you're sort of assessing which outcome measure and then you're designing the program, you might want to think about it differently. Another example of, you might have started an intervention being delivered in a particular way 5 years ago, but over time the practitioners realize it's more effective to deliver it in this way. So I think it's really important before you evaluate something that everyone's on the same page about the objectives, the outcome, the rationale, the assumptions, so that in the end, the outcome measure that we're assessing is picking up what the intervention is intended to do. So this is an attainment-raising example, something happening before university and schools. Next slide. This was a progression intervention, same template, so you can see we populate these things on our website also to show different providers what might be relevant for their context, because we have, I think, even more diverse and stratified sector than you do with the number of providers in terms of size. Next slide. So that's our toolkit I've already talked about. These are the kinds of webinars that we run. Some of them you might find useful even in this context. These are some of the evaluations we've done that are on our website. We did one on online teaching and learning, specifically looking at, after COVID, whether there was an effect on inequalities. We also are committed to open science, so we produce and publish our research protocols. That's one that we did with King's. I did want to come back. I know I'm in a rush. I do have like 2-3 more slides I need to go through. I just wanted to say, we do try to focus on causal evidence, but it is important that you select your methodology on your research question and what kind of intervention you're doing. And I've used this kind of somewhat silly example, but don't use a fork to eat soup. If you've got an intervention that has a small sample size, you obviously aren't going to run a randomized control trial on it, or if it's unethical to do so for other reasons. But if you do, you should consider running a more quantitative method. You should consider, in making that assessment, you should consider what data do you actually have available and need, how the target population is chosen for the intervention, whether or not you want to use some mixed methods, and whether or not you can move towards causal quasi-experimental design. And finally, this is my slides on data collection, because I do think there's been some discussion about data collection, but I think the questions of data sharing, data linkage, are just as important. So UK, it's often England, collects national data on education. One of the things we have is a national pupil database for every single child in schools, and universities can access that database once they get permission from the Office for National Statistics. That's really useful for tracking whether or not an intervention had an effect on an individual student, right? Because you can see the impact over time. So I think data collection at university level is important, but you need to be able to link it both to school level, ideally individual level data, and I appreciate that raises privacy considerations, and you do need to have proper ethics, and we've just done a piece of work looking at the outcomes for free school meal children based on the kind of university they went to 16 years afterwards. So we are also linking the longitudinal employment outcomes survey, which uses HMRC, the tax data. So, that to do that work, it's not merely that you need to collect data, you have to link the data and you have to have access to it. One of the other good things is we also have infrastructure for providers. So there's OFS dashboards for each individual provider that every university gets and you can publicly access. And then we have these various acronymy bodies, HESA, the Higher Education Statistical Authority, UCAS, which is the admissions. All admissions go through one institution, UCAS, which is actually quite useful. We're doing a randomized control trial to see whether or not we can increase the uptick of disclosure of mental health difficulties through that. HEAT is the Higher Education Access Tracker, and I've said about LEO. And my final point, because I don't have much more time, is on the, I'll just go to my lessons learned. Sorry, I'll go back. So my lessons learned are, well, one thing is don't try to set up an organization under a global pandemic. That was a bit of a nightmare, hiring people, pensions, et cetera, getting a bank account. I think in terms of research and evaluation, I've presented a really tidy picture of what we do, but the real world is messy. Hopefully you heard about that in the summer schools when we had to move online and we had to rethink about delivering it. But I do think we should still try to be ambitious and deliver those RCTs and QEDs where we can. I do think it's important to be flexible and responsive when delivery changes. The sector does need upskilling. We can't just expect this to happen overnight. There is going to be a requirement of investment. There's going to be a requirement for the government to support the sector to do this well, to support data collection. Inequalities are persistent and extensive. So, there's a lot of different groups and a lot of different universities, but they also vary substantially across populations, geographies, and institutions. So I do think there is space for providers or institutions to take their own approach. I do also think the role of TASO as an independent charity in between the regulator, this probably is not likely to be the model that you take, but I think there's some lessons there around consensus, around collaboration, and around partnerships, as I've said here. And finally, I do think in addition to top-down change coming from government or from the regulator or from vice chancellors, and from regulatory and policy push, you also need to have that sort of student buy-in and student voice, because ultimately they're going to help you prioritize those issues, deliver those issues to the best, and ultimately they're the reason why we're here. Those are the outcomes that we're trying to change. Every single data point is a human being, and so the reason why we care about measuring these things is not just because I'm a quant, it's because I care about what happens to those people behind those numbers. Thank you.
You did fine, don't we? We did start late, so it's okay.
Yeah, I did too many slides.
I wasn't trying to rush you too much. So we got some time for some questions both in the room and on Slido. We've already got a couple of good Slido questions, and there was one that I was really keen to ask as well, which is, and you mentioned it when we were having a cup of tea before, how do you run a randomised control trial without purposely excluding some students? You said there was some sort of resistance as well as some ignorance about this. So how do you do that without people thinking some people are missing out?
Yeah, I mean, it's a well-known question in running trials, and I think where you have, in the case of summer schools, it's heavily oversubscribed. So you have to have some selection criteria. So I think it's harder to run an RCT where there's not oversubscription. In fact, it would not be ethical. There are other ways to do it. So you could delay. You could have a delayed RCT. And then try to measure some intermediate outcome. We are also running quasi-experimental designs, which I think could be useful. But yeah, in the case of the summer schools, I think there was consensus and agreement with the providers that most of the students who were applying deserved a place anyway, and they were going to have to make a judgment that a selection criterion that was going to need justification. Random allocation is no less unethical than choosing some students rather than others for a place that you think is going to benefit all of them, but also you think is going to benefit all of them. So the evidence wasn't strong enough to demonstrate that. If you had evidence that was decisive, that showed that the intervention absolutely benefited those students, it would be unethical to run a randomized control trial. What we're doing is we're testing, is that the case? So there always has to be a question mark whether or not the intervention has any evidence of success. There has to be oversubscription. You should publish your protocols publicly so people can follow what you've done. and you have to put in an ethics application. So there are a lot of steps. The other thing I would say about that is I think RCTs deserve scrutiny, both for their ethics and their methodology, but so do qualitative research. I sometimes feel that this question implies that it's easier, cheaper, or less ethically complicated to run qualitative interviews. If you're interviewing, disabled students about their experience and you're not sensitive about that, that is no less unethical than running a poorly designed quantitative study.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions in the room, and then I'll come back to the slide. One over here, Andrew Harvey.
Thanks. I'll come around so you don't have to
Yeah.
squint. Really enjoyed that presentation, and great to get a view from the UK. I had one specific question and then a broader question. The specific question was whether you've come across any evaluations of the Race Equality Charter since its introduction in the UK, because we're having those discussions here on a similar level. And the broader question was, you mentioned the sector needs more capacity building. It's a massive problem here, partly because of the way that equity is so marginalised within the university that there's very little academic leadership in this space. Practitioners are trying to design evaluations that are often quite complex without necessarily the support from the academy to do it. So I wondered again what has worked in terms of building capacity in the UK, not only to evaluate but to do more research around this space as well, because again we have limited research and evaluation capacity, I think, for equity. So we're keeping Nadine in business, which is good, but we're not having enough of our internal support and connections between the practitioners and the researchers.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I appreciate it. I think, so as I said, I think on the racial inequalities that we have in higher education, I wrote a paper on it in 2003, and it wasn't getting much cut through then as a researcher. So I do think that the shift in public opinion and that bottom-up pressure has made a difference. I think we do have I don't know the Australian research context well enough, but there is a decent cohort of people working on race and ethnicity in particular. We do now have some institutions have pro-vice chancellors for equality, diversity, and inclusion, so reporting directly. I don't know if you have analogous positions, but obviously that brings it to senior leadership. I do think, so having said that the targets-based approach didn't work, I do sometimes wonder about KPIs. If you make it part of someone's assessment, whether or not students of certain backgrounds are improving their outcomes, I think you might see that as a quicker driver. And on the practitioners, we have done, on the back of our ethnicity degree awarding gap work, which unfortunately didn't find an effective outcome from what we looked at, we worked with 8 providers to try to help them develop theories of change. So one was on a dissertation writing residential. We did some curricular reform things. We did some work with academics. So we are here to try to support and partner that work. But it is, I think one of the reasons why there's been investment is because of the Office for Student as a Regulator. I think it's undeniable. When I go to Scotland and Wales, it's very clear that they are ambivalent about the regulatory function, but because it's part of the access and participation plans, vice chancellors have allocated resource specifically for evaluators, right? They have to show, and because as you see in the regulatory notice, it's a requirement, you have to demonstrate that you're hiring people to do that work. But in tight budgets, it is a challenge because it means something else is then not being funded. But there are now, almost every university would have 2 or 3 evaluators, and they would then try to work with practitioners and with researchers in designing those access and participation plans, which are usually the responsibility of a pro-vice chancellor to show what they're actually doing. So that, it has been a lever. There's no question about it.
Okay, got a question here.
Thanks very much. Kerry Lee Krause, Vice-Chancellor at Avondale University. Thanks so much for your presentation. I was particularly pleased to hear about your focus on the student voice, which is great. My question, Omar, is about, you've reported on really interesting research and evaluations. What I'm interested in knowing in terms of application here in Australia is, do you have involvement in synthesising the outcomes of all of that and actually informing a joined-up approach to systemic strategy and policy development?
Yes. So I think we haven't quite cracked how do you evaluate, and particularly things that are systemic, because it's quite tricky because you're making a lot of different changes at the same time. We're working on that. We're looking at sort of how do you robustly evaluate what we call multi-intervention approaches. And it does actually come back to the Race Equality Charter, I think. The Race Equality Charter tends to have lots of different elements in it that institutions are trying, are being asked to achieve. We do evidence synthesis at that first stage to identify the gaps, but in terms of what works, we're still, I think, at the incipient phase, I think it's fair to say, even on the particular interventions, for example, on summer schools. But we're working internally to think, that's our kind of next thing we're going to commission. What does robust evaluation of systemic approaches look like? Because, in the kind of traditional view of causal research, you want to keep as many things constant and change only one thing, make only one intervention change. A systemic approach is almost the opposite of that, and it sort of seems like they cut against each other. And to the extent that the sector and equity practitioners feel like systemic approaches are the way forward, we are aware and are trying to respond to that by providing tools and resources for robust evaluation of systemic approaches.
I think there was someone down here. Here we go.
I'll stand, I think. Thank you, Omar. That was terrific. Professor Jenny Short, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, University of Adelaide. Now, you mentioned you wanted to be ambitious, and I feel for you setting up the office through TASO, through COVID. But, of course, we may look back on those as the good old days. And I say that because you mentioned 1 in 6 having a mental health illness in the UK. I think the proportions are higher here. I think it's of 18 to 25-year-olds, it's now 1/3. 1 in 3 has a reported or diagnosed mental ill health. So that's one context. The other context is financial stress. So a number of our institutions here are in financial stress. And I know in the UK I've heard the figure may be as high as 70 out of 150 are suffering financial stress to real financial distress. And you mentioned insolvency. So in that context, I just wonder how do you see the trends? If you could predict them or think about them, how would you see that impacting on the relationship that you have with university partners? And how do you see that impacting on their ability to engage in measuring interventions and, in fact, engage in making interventions and enacting change in the sector?
Yeah, it's a huge, big and important question, and I do think this costs money to do this well. And as I said, not just big randomized control trials, but good qualitative research needs, effective investment. And I can't speak to the Australian context, but yes, UK higher education is chronically underfunded, and it's increasingly the case. So I think mental health support is a key area here where universities are being asked to do more, in part because the NHS services have been also cut, and there's an issue there. So I think universities also feel in the UK context that underinvestment in public services has happened, and now we're being asked to sort of, backfill, especially around student mental health. We need more investment in higher education. If there's not that investment, then it's hard to see. I think there is a consensus. I don't know if you saw a letter yesterday by 4 former university ministers, 2 Conservative, 2 Labour, saying that there needs to be more investment in higher education. The funding model, the income from fees, although it may seem high here, and it is high, $92.50 per student per year, has been capped since 2014. Obviously, we know something's happened to inflation since 2014, so if your income line is flat and your expenditure is going up, there's obviously only one way that's going to go. And it also, I know you have the same issue here, has led to a huge increase in international student recruitment, which has also now become a political issue. So, yeah, it's hard to see how universities, though I think someone else on the previous panel said, can expand without dealing with equity. And the groups that are least likely to attend are the ones that we need to see more likely to attend. But there needs to be ongoing government commitment. There is some indication that there's awareness of this, but in the priority list of things that need investing in, higher education often isn't at the top of that politically.
I'll just go to some Slido commentary here. In fact, you talked about your mental health study. Someone was asking, is it possible to get a copy of it? Is it up on your website?
It is, yeah. We have an evidence hub and then we have the review, and we're doing more work. We're actually, I don't think any of you can apply, but we have an invitation to tender of trying to do a quasi-experimental design looking at mental health interventions.
Sure. Elaine Butler asks, she's interested in the decision not to use the term equity.
Yeah.
So will you explain the thinking behind that and any ongoing impact? And I say, why not? Why don't you have equity indicators?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I wouldn't. So I think part of it is I'm following kind of the policy language that's used in the UK context. I wouldn't necessarily oppose equity per se. We have equality law. So the sort of characteristics is sometimes used, equality characteristics. So under the Equality Act, which was passed in 2010, the various equality characteristics. That's the term, and I mean, I think also equity is unfavored by the current UK government.
Sure. Any questions more in the room here? As Ian walks way down there, I'll ask one more online, which is quite a funny one. In our sector, our theory of change seems to be that if we make enough adjustments and run enough programs, then we can reach equity for underserved groups. And how do we shift this? Well, that's what TASO and ACSES is about.
Exactly. I think trying to get people not defensive about that, that's one lesson. If I made one mistake, it was like messaging too hard this thought, which I even messaged today, which is it's not good enough to care. You have to look at what you're doing. Some people hear that as, are you saying that what I'm doing is useless? And so you have to message that softly. It's like, I think that you are trying your best, and I actually suspect what you're doing is having some good impact for some students. But let's really try to unpick that. Let's figure out why it's not working for all of them. You know, we can improve this. It's not about saying it's bad. It's about tweaking it to make it better. But I do think we have to hold open the possibility that some of what we're doing is not working and is actually making life worse for some students. And that's a tricky thing.
Sure. Probably our last question down here.
Hi, my name's...
You're right.
Can you hear me? I'm Jo, I'm from TAFE New South Wales, but for years I was a professional staff member at universities. And I just wondered, how do you bridge the gap that I think exists here, where you have a lot of professional staff who are delivering the services on the ground, that academic disconnect of you're a professional staff, stay away from my research, and then actually translating it into a whole of culture change to actually support students?
That's a great question. I mean, our resources are actually directed at practitioners, staff, professional staff, not academic staff, because they're the people being tasked by universities to deliver these access and participation plans. I think what's happened is because it's moved up the priority list, universities are trying to allocate, they're trying to figure out where in this institution do we have resource to help the practitioners deliver more robust evaluation. So yeah, it does need a more joined up approach, and I do find that one of our we haven't cracked that, is my honest answer to that. And I think there does need to be more cross-fertilization between the academic staff, who often have the expertise in research methods, and the practitioners who actually know what's happening on the ground for those students. And there needs to be, that's one of the reasons we think just working together in a room on a theory of change, like what are we doing here? Why do we think it's going to work? How would we measure that? Starting from kind of basics with that. But also, yeah, if senior leaders can help practitioners, if you're the head of professional services, has a good connection to the senior academic staff and can be like, look, I need someone. I don't know them. Can you help me find them? I mean, maybe we could do better around things like, I don't know, databases on that. I don't know, like you could tag that this professor's really interested in applied methods.
There's a question here which I'll answer on behalf of Shamit. There's a question for Shamit. Can ACSES play a similar role to TASO in regarding evaluation, capability building and sharing of resources? And the answer is yes. Okay. Can we all please say thanks very much to Omar for his presentation?
Sure.